And we are live with This Week in Mining. Welcome back, everybody. And I'm joined right now by the legendary Doug Casey. I'm super excited to host this conversation. Thank you all for showing up. This is a live show, so if you have questions, hit us up in the chat. I've got it right beside me. I'll see your questions. We will get to them. But Doug, thanks for coming on today. I'm excited to chat with you. And there's a host of different directions that I want to go. We were just chatting before I hit record about a number of kind of juicy topics, Argentinian, Canadian politics, and a handful of others. But before we get to that stuff, I want to talk about the gold market with you because gold is holding near all-time highs right now. And suddenly firms like Goldman Sachs, who have been bearish on gold for 13 years, are now calling for $2,700 gold, all this, lots of this going on right now. You've been in this market for 45 years. You've seen markets come and go. You've seen investors get rich, go broke, get rich again, go broke again. You've stayed at the top of the game, cycle after cycle. So big question to begin, but just to get some context, how do you read the health and opportunity in the gold sector right now?
Gold is going higher, both in nominal and in real terms. And more than anything else, I think it's being driven by the ongoing and accelerating collapse of Western civilization and the currencies that these idiotic governments and central banks all over the world, with no exceptions actually, are cranking out. And all right, let's say gold is closing in on 2,400 right now. All-time high? Well, not really, because in 1980, it hit $850 an ounce. And in real dollars, deflated dollars, that's something on the order of 3,000, 3,200, depends on whose inflation numbers you want to use. And the nature of the crisis we're confronting now is much more serious than what we experienced back in 1980. So, yeah, it's going higher.
And what do you make of equities not really responding? I mean, some of the major miners are up, but generally speaking, the gold stocks haven't moved at all, which is either confused or frustrated or both for most investors. But once again, you've been through so many cycles. What do you read? How do you read this?
Well, this is a very unusual cycle because since gold was freed up in 1971, I did a study of this, actually. I can't find it. We've had 5 major bull markets in the past, and I've mainly looked at the little companies, the explorers and developers and smaller producers. And that whole group, each time, has actually run something like 10 to 1, with some stocks going 100 to 1, and a couple that I've actually owned going 1,000 to 1. That's not happening this time. So why not? I can think of a number of reasons why the junior miners are lagging. One is that their costs are going up almost as fast as the gold price. Okay, that works against them. But more important is that I think people have finally come to realize that mining itself, and I've been saying this for years, mining is a crappy industry. It's a 19th century choo-choo train industry. Young people don't want to go out and play in the dirt with big yellow trucks. They'd rather crunch bits and bytes on computers as opposed to rocks. And mining has become harder over the years. You think it would become easier with all kinds of technological innovations making discoveries and production and everything easier. But in point of fact, from a financial point of view, going from the top down, everybody hates mining. It's raping Mother Earth. It's not ecological. This is all bullshit, of course. But this is what the people that control the media and the thought memes in universities are saying. So nobody wants to go near it for ideological reasons. If you find a viable deposit which of course it's like an Easter egg hunt over hundreds of square miles, so it's not easy to do. But if you find it, then your trouble's, and it's expensive to go on this Easter egg hunt. So that's why most of these companies go bankrupt. But if you find it, then your trouble really begins, because now you got to develop it. Now we're talking tens of millions of dollars. And, now if you got a proven reserve of something or other, now you got to build the mine, and you're talking scores of millions or hundreds of millions or more. How are you going to raise that capital in an atmosphere where ESG and DEI and things like that, these big outfits like BlackRock that control all the money, they don't want to touch mining. It's politically incorrect. So it's very hard to raise money for anything. And of course, what's Canada done, which is the epicenter for raising money in the mining? It raised capital gains to 66% or something like that, which is actually insane. I mean, the only returns you get are capital gains. You lose most of your money along the way, and then if you pick a winner, they're going to steal 2/3 of it. So no, but listen, these stocks will run at some point. The public will get its bit in their teeth, and run with them. But these things are like salmon swimming upstream. Odds are against them.
When you touch on the tax policy, and we're seeing capital gains adjustments in Canada and in the US, and there's a real misunderstanding, isn't there, right, between policymakers and why people invest. And you think, if you're the politician, I get that the lip service narrative they spit out to the public is, we're finding another way to tax the rich. It's like, okay, like, do you understand how small businesses grow? Do you understand why they go to raise money? That's the other side of the transaction, right? It's not like investors are just like, somebody's raising money. That's what you're investing in. Now, why would somebody be raising money? Answer that question. It's a question that is so simple, but I just don't feel like any politician has asked step 2 of that implication, right? If you tax the investor and penalize the investor and remove the incentive, then the company can't raise money. Now, what happens to the economic growth if small companies can't raise cash to grow? And that part is never part of the conversation.
Well, listen, the first mistake that most people make, Jay, is imputing goodwill to politicians. Anybody that goes into politics, and there are very few, almost no exceptions to this, there are people that want to control other people and think they have the right to do it, and they know how to do it. And it doesn't matter how glib and how nice and how intelligent they seem like. People that go into politics are essentially sociopaths. Many of them are actually psychopaths or snakes in suits. So that you can't expect good things from these people. All they do is tax, so they have more money to spend, regulate, so they have more power in their hands, make themselves personally wealthy. I can't tell you how much I despise the political class, absolutely everywhere, because only a certain type of person gets into politics. I don't support any politicians anywhere. Well, there is one exception. Probably be disappointed, but yeah.
I want to pull on that thread in a minute. Okay, so look, I'm up in Canada, as you know. I've been very troubled by the direction of this country for a host of reasons, not just the capital gains tax, which the effective capital gains tax in Canada is around 33%, because the first 50% of a capital gains is not taxable. So this increase applies to the second 50%. Nonetheless, it's a big chunk of cash, and it's significant. To say that it isn't is just fallacy. But my wife and I have been watching the trajectory of Canadian culture and economic policy, and wondering, should we stay, right? And this is a question that is somewhat maybe controversial, because it's a country that's given so much to me in terms of opportunity. I was raised in a safe, predictable, land of opportunity. It was great. At this point in my career, I got 3 young kids. I'm like, do I put them, where's the land of opportunity for them? And is it still Canada? And if it isn't, where do we go? And a lot of the response to this will be like, oh, how could you abandon the place that's given so much to you? And, it's kind of silly, because I'm looking at my tax receipt saying, I've given so much to it, actually. But, what are your thoughts on that? Either because my wife is like, either stop complaining or get involved in politics, right? So,
Yeah. Well, if you get involved in politics, it will ruin your life and it will tend to corrupt your character. So I think that's a mistake to try to join the enemy camp in order to change it from within. No, I think that at this point, many Canadians and Americans are doing what their ancestors did. When things became too oppressive in the old world, they left to the new world where things were freer and there was more opportunity. The problem is, and I've been to 155 countries, most of them several times, and I've lived in 10 countries in addition. And I can tell you that the whole world is going in the wrong direction. If what's important to you is personal freedom and financial opportunity. So it's becoming harder and harder to find a place where you can live free and actualize yourself without becoming a serf. And the fact that you have all these overweening international organizations, para-governmental organizations, the World Health Organization, the OECD, the UN, all these UN agencies, plus NGOs, which are actually a semi-governmental force unto themselves now, in many cases having billions of dollars under their control, and they're all run by the same kind of people. So these people have insinuated themselves everywhere. They're like termites tearing apart the world's house. It's quite a problem. Maybe things will get bad enough that if they get too bad, things will change. Well, like here in Argentina, this was where I am right now in Buenos Aires. And as I guess a lot of people know, 100 years ago, Argentina was one of the most prosperous countries in the world, one of the 3, 4, 5 most prosperous countries in the world. And especially with the accession of Juan Perón after World War II, he modeled the country after Benito Mussolini's Italy. And incidentally, Mussolini coined the word fascism. And fascism doesn't really have anything to do with jackboots and things like that. Fascism is the combination of the the state with corporations, public-private partnership. So that's what we have most places in the world. And Argentina has been run into the ground. 50% of the Argentine population now, it's said, are living in poverty. That's poverty by Latin American standards. That's shocking for what was a really developed country. So things got so bad that a chap named Javier Milei ran for president, and he won. Why? Because he's a totally sincere, totally outspoken, anarcho-capitalist. He doesn't believe the government has the right to exist. He believes it's purely destructive, and he wants to go as far as he can to abolish it. I'm not kidding. And he's not lying. And he's acting to do exactly that. And living here in Argentina and Uruguay too, just across the Plate River, the changes are noticeable, and they're just beginning, and they're excellent. So there is hope. There's always hope.
What's most surprising about Milei is that he's actually reducing government quickly and dramatically. And I think he's eliminated, a few thousand government jobs already, which is
tens of thousands, actually.
Tens of thousands. So a politician that actually does that after they're elected is the rarest thing in the world. I mean, again, like we were chatting before I hit record, we have the leader of the opposition party in Canada, Pierre Poilievre, who is just winning favor with the public right now because he's incredibly charismatic and witty and dances circles around journalists. And is crushing Trudeau in the debates, and he's funny, like he's an entertaining guy. He's also running on this message that he's here to reduce the size of government and walk back the overreach and all of this stuff, and everybody's buying it. Meanwhile, one quick glance at this guy's resume and you realize he's never, ever had a job outside of government. That's the only place he's ever worked. This is the guy who's going to reduce government, right? It's like, but people buy into it. Yet Malay's actually doing that. And you're seeing results because Argentina, I've got a buddy, Diego, in BA who manages money down there. He sends me screenshots of the inflation numbers. And, it was like 11% per month, right? Only 18 months ago, not long ago.
More than that. It was more than that, actually, yeah. But the rate of currency debasement and therefore retail price increases, retail price inflation is dropping noticeably here. In fact, it's very inconvenient when you live in a country that has, I'll show you something, that has a lot of inflation. This is a half of a brick. When you go to get money to, just do stuff here, this isn't even half of a brick. I've got more. Just to have money to walk around with, it's really inconvenient. Now, here, look at this. This is what you got to do if you got to. What do I have? A peso's worth 1,000 pesos to the dollar. So a peso's worth a tenth of a penny. So I've got these are little bricks of 100,000 peso notes. This is $500. This is $200. But you need this unless you're going to use credit cards. It's insane. But the rate of price rises and currency debasement is dropping radically. And he's cut expenses to the extent that the government has run a surplus, a cash surplus for the first time in at least 15 years. And I'm not for government surpluses because that just means taxes should be cut so that they go down to zero. But his next step is going to be to radically cut taxes, radically cut import duties. They have export duties in this country, for instance. It's one of the world's major producers of soybeans and wheat and cattle. And they have export duties on these things. Talk about something that's insane. They're called retenciones, where the government, before you put your produce on the boat, takes 35% of the value. And then whatever's left, you pay income taxes on. I mean, this is a great way to just kill production. I mean, these governments down here are insane. And the Brazilians are said to be worse than Argentina, actually. But they survive. I mean, I like Latin America, despite all this. But then again, my income is in dollars from abroad.
Yeah. Do you think is it too early to say that Malay is going to turn the country around? I mean, they've got the resources to do it if managed correctly. Argentina is a bounty, right? They have the potential to export a lot of what the world needs, and not frivolous resources, but as you mentioned, food, agricultural products,
and minerals, everything. The answer is it'll work. And the reason I say it's going to work is because he has actual reality on his side. And he was elected by an overwhelming margin because people were so fed up and they liked his radicalism. It's not that they understand Austrian economics or libertarian theory. They don't. But they could see that he wanted to make radical changes so that look, I'm betting, I own a lot of land here in Argentina, and you can buy a lot of land here really cheaply. I mean, unbelievably cheaply. I think it's going to go way up in price because I've talked to a number of Europeans, especially in the last month. People come down here and they get in touch. Some Italians, some Germans, and others, and they want to get the hell out of Europe. They really do. because it's just too stultifying. And if I was a European that had any get up and go or any assets, I'd get the hell out of Europe because it's turning into a socialist slave state. That sounds like an outrageous thing to say, but it's true. And they think the solution to their problem is by importing tens of millions of Middle Easterners and Africans, which is only going to make things worse for them.
I want to pull on that thread for a minute. What's your take? You know, I had a guest on this morning on my podcast on the Jay Martin show. He was the former head of counterterrorism with the CIA for 28 years. He's no longer with the organization. Well, professionally, I guess. I don't know if you ever really leave the CIA or if you're always kind of in the basket.
That sounds like Larry Johnson. It wasn't, was it?
No, it was Bernard Hudson.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, it airs this Saturday. But I just wanted to get his take on that specifically. And, you know, it's a phenomenon to a degree. 9 million people in the country just in the last 3 years. And no one really knows, you know, who they are, where they're from. And I'm sort of for free movement, generally speaking, and pro-immigration. But this is counter to everything else that occurs within the United States. Like I can't catch a plane in the US without 6 or 7 different screening steps along the way. So it's abnormal that there would be an open border. It's weird, right? But what he pointed out is that it's very strange how this is just a trafficking operation, more or less, right? A product is being trafficked across the border in exchange for profit. Somebody's making a lot of money off moving these people that want to get into the US. But and that's to dehumanize it. I get it. That may sound cruel, but you know, step back from what's the actual operation going on here. But when it comes to every other product that's trafficked, we're kind of aware of who's leading these organizations. We know about, you know, the Cali cartel or El Chapo. We know the cartel leaders who are trafficking product, but no one seems to know the names or the organizations behind this massive trafficking operation. And he's unsure why. He's like, to be honest, despite 30 years in the organization, is an unanswered question. You know, it could just be there's so much money being made that the right people are getting paid off. And it's as simple as that. Do you have any thoughts on that, Doug?
Well, I think it's mostly NGOs that are doing it, quite frankly, that are facilitating all these people coming north. And the NGOs are rather unbelievably, they're subsidized by the US government, which, you know, pays things like the Red Cross and Doctors Without Borders and all that, gives them millions of dollars that's appropriated to them. And they're also very wealthy just in themselves, because when a rich person dies, doesn't know what to do with his money, hasn't trained his kids in a way that they won't just become junkies if he gives them all that money. So what do? You give it to a good sounding NGO, and they're populated by the same kind of people that get into government. And that's what's going on. But it's worse than that, because once these people get into the US, they're flown or bused at government expense to different cities. They're given cell phones. Many of them are given credit cards to live on. They're put up in hotels. They're bought tents that are put in big encampments. I mean, when you import 9 million people in a short period of time, where the hell are you going to put them? How are you going to feed them? And most of them are young men who will do what young men always do. They'll get in trouble. They'll form gangs. So that's going to happen. And why is the Biden government, which is populated by Jacobins, actually, the people in this government are self-reinforcing with the worst kind of people that you can possibly find from a freedom point of view. They expect these people to all vote Democrat in the November elections. So it's going to be very, very unpleasant, because the kind of the average middle American who's a Trump voter, because Trump is a cultural conservative, he's an idiot in many ways. Economically, he's almost as bad as Biden, actually. Well, not in all respects, but in many. But he's a cultural conservative. He doesn't want to overturn the nature of America, but these other people do. So it's this is not going to end well. it's going to be a real big upset come November, I think. I think Trump will win the popular vote, but that's not to say that he'll be installed as president.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So that's to say that it doesn't matter who wins, the other side will not accept the outcome. Is that essentially what you're saying?
Neither side will accept the other side's. Yeah, that's going to happen. But I think the Democrats are going to win because if the country goes for a lot of mail-in voting, the Democrats are historically much better at fraud than the Republicans.
Okay, I see.
So they'll do that. And of course, electronic voting machines are a big mistake because you can program these things like you can any other computer. You can do that. They'll have the immigrants voting in their favor. And of course, look, half of the country elected, well, they always elect, they'll elect any fool. I mean, look, George Bush, a nightmare. Obama, a nightmare. I mean, Biden, who was half dead and low intelligence and senile, they elected him. So anybody can be elected.
What's
I just
your
wonder if Biden's elected and he dies in office or is replaced, are they going to have Kamala to replace him with? I mean, this gets scary, really scary.
Do you think RFK is enough of an outsider to unify the people in any way, or is he too on edge? What are your thoughts?
Well, there's a lot of things to like about RFK. He's very much against health mandates, these vaccines and so forth, which of course is being used against him because the average person has been propagandized into believing that great hysteria had anything to it. He's a lefty and comes from the lefty party, so he's fine with taxes, he's fine with welfare and so forth, but he's generally speaking anti-war, or at least he seems to be. So, and he could get into office because you've got the blue states and the red states in the US. Everybody knows one is voting for Biden, the other is voting for Trump. Assuming those are the two candidates, it's still too early to be sure. But there are 7 major swing states that could go either way. And if through manipulations and so forth, he can make sure because of that neither candidate gets enough electoral votes to be installed as president. Now, because let's say he takes 20% of the vote, just suppose, or just in those 7 states so that they don't get enough electoral votes. Now what's going to happen? It goes to the House of Representatives. And then it's a whole different kettle of fish that's hard to predict because each state gets 1 vote. So anything could happen. And since these red people and blue people hate each other so much, maybe they'll go for a third compromise candidate. It's very hard to predict. It's a chaotic situation.
It is. Yeah, I want to come back to that in a minute, but there's a specific topic that I wanted to get your thoughts on because you spent a lot of time on the continent of Africa and actually hold a record for book sales. You have the highest selling book ever in a country called Rhodesia. Your record will never be broken because Rhodesia no longer exists. But
that's right. Quite correct.
There's been an epidemic of coups occurring across the Sahel region of Africa. There's been 9 coups in the last 3 years. Another 6 failed attempts, but they were close. And the now famous Wagner Group is very active, rebranded as Africa Corp, parading around the Sahel region, offering regime change protection to governments. Essentially, it's like an insurance policy against, I guess, unrest in exchange for fantastic deals on natural resource extraction. Have you been following that story, Doug? And what's your take? Do you have one on what's going on the ground. Because now I believe even in Sudan, there's, Russian and Ukrainian forces on the ground fighting each other in Sudan. Do you have a take
Yeah.
on? Yeah.
Once again, it's a semi-insoluble problem. And the basic reason for it is that not one country in Africa, well, with the possible exceptions of Ethiopia and South Africa, they were all drawn, their borders were drawn in the boardrooms of Europe with no relationship whatsoever to the people that happen to be in these various countries. So and Africa's totally tribal. I mean, not just hundreds, but thousands of tribes that are put into a country someplace. And once they get there, they want each of the big men want to get control of the government, because then they can lord it over the other tribe and dispense all the money that the government garners to their buddies as well as themselves. So that's what you're dealing with. You're not dealing with entities that, well, Swaziland is different. Okay, that's a kingdom, but it doesn't lend itself to Western ideas of so-called democracy, which actually the West doesn't lend itself to anymore either. And in the case of those French colonies in North Africa, they feel exploited by the French. Now, you can make the argument that people in Africa should have been happy when Da Gama was rounding the Cape if he just thrown out a wheel, because they didn't have the wheel back then. But he would have had to have thrown out an instruction book too, because they didn't know how to read. But so whites have done a lot of good for Africans, but they did it coercively, violently. It would have happened with free trade between the Africans and the Europeans. It's a chaotic situation. None of those countries should exist in their present form, and they'll all fall apart. They'll all fall apart into new countries, just like Sudan split into Sudan and South Sudan. I mean, fortunately, that was kind of relatively peaceful. Not peaceful the way Czechoslovakia breaking into Czechia and Slovakia was, but it's going to happen to a lot of countries.
What's your take on the synchronization of a lot of these conflicts? When you look at the outbreak of war in Europe, the outbreak of hot war in the Middle East, this coup of epidemics, which have been very violent across the Sahel region. And let's be honest, these are not, ground up grassroots uprisings. These are funded by, proxies. And one argument is just this is China and Russia deterring American interest in African resources. This is a place where a lot of the necessities of the world come from: agriculture products, energy products, et cetera. Rising tensions in the South China Sea. The point is, every direction on the globe right now, we're seeing eruptions of pretty severe conflicts that don't seem to have an end in sight and definitely look like they're set up to continue escalating through the balance of this decade. Is that a coincidence and these are isolated territorial disputes? Or do you think there's a more concerted force at play?
Well, I've got to say that the US government is at root with a lot of the problems that we have in the world today. In this thing between the Ukraine and Russia, for instance, that's really just a border war between a couple of nothing, nowhere countries. Ukraine means borderland, and it only became a country when Lenin made it a country in 1922. It didn't exist before then. So border adjustment. Little bit, this is kind of interesting background. I don't think most people are familiar with this, that in 2014, Ukraine was controlled by a pro-Russian and corrupt guy. So what? They're all corrupt. Then the so-called Maidan Revolution replaced him with a pro-American stooge. And you know what happened right away after that? The Russian provinces of Ukraine, which shouldn't have been in the Ukraine anyway, seceded. And Kiev attacked them. And there was a border war going on there in the Donetsk starting in 2014 with about 20,000 casualties, which is quite a few, okay? So Putin sees this, that Russians are being attacked. That's a problem. And then, of course, with a Western stooge as opposed to a Russian stooge running the Ukraine, he can't lose the Crimea, which was historically always part of Russia. How that became part of Ukraine was because of essentially a drunken party with Khrushchev and internal politics. But the Russians have their biggest naval base there. So you can't have that in the hands of an enemy regime. And it was, you can say it's revanchist, but it was Russian anyway. So yeah, it's understandable within the context of the way these governments work, why Putin invaded Ukraine. But the US has kept this war going, and it's cost the deaths of, they say, nobody knows, 500,000 Ukrainian soldiers with hundreds of thousands more serious injuries. And it's only because the US is fomenting it and arming it and keeping it going. Otherwise, the Russians just would have taken those provinces and Crimea, end of story. So that's what's happened there. And of course, when it comes to Israel, look, how is it any of America's business what goes on between the Israelis and the Palestinians? This is like getting involved with the fight between the Hatfields and the McCoys. Whose side do you want to take between the Hatfields and the McCoys? And generally speaking, I favor the Israelis because they at least represent Western civilization. And I'm quite anti-Islamic, actually. But that's a different subject that I can annoy some more people with telling them why I think that Mohammedanism is a very destructive and evil cult. But despite the fact that you can say the Israelis are the good guys, but then there's reasons why they're the bad guys with how they got there and took the Palestine. It's none of our business. Just don't send money to both of them, which is what we're doing now. Mm-hmm. It's like sending shiploads of arms to both the Hatfields and the McCoys. That's not a formula for success for anybody, just a lot of dead people. Mm. And of course, Israel's in a lot of trouble anyway, with 2 billion Muslims that are against it for religious/ideological reasons. They're just in a world of trouble, but they have nuclear weapons. But then again, the Iranians have or could shortly have nuclear weapons, as do the Pakistanis. So I don't see how this ends well. Do you know how it ends well?
I don't. I would say that if the Russian invasion of Ukraine looked like it was a bit disorganized and chaotic and initially unsuccessful, I think that is also textbook Russian warfare. If you look at the history of Russian warfare, it typically begins very disorganized, chaotic, undersupplied, leadership changes, and it's a mess, right? And through sheer volume of bodies and time, they eventually end up throwing their weight around. And so, you know, when they initially invaded and it was sort of reported that they didn't have their ducks in a row, essentially, right? They were getting, logistics were a mess. They were undersupplied. Soldiers were being forced onto the front lines, didn't want to be there. They were deserting, all of this stuff. And it was like, oh, this is going to be a disaster for the Russians. But that was the case in every single war that I've ever read about with the Russians. And, you know, through duration, they're a massive country with tons of bodies to throw at a problem. And that's been the strategy in the past. And I imagine that's the strategy today. You know, there's two like core schools of thought that I've uncovered. And this is maybe obvious, but on the Jay Martin show, my podcast, And there's two very strong opinions that come up most frequently. And number one is this is not our fight. It's an unwinnable fight for the Ukrainians. By sending money and weapons, we're just prolonging an unnecessary conflict with an already inevitable end, and therefore increasing the Ukrainian body count because we're keeping them in the fight, a fight that they can't win, right? It's like pushing your buddy back into the center of the circle when he's already bloodied up, right?
That's the view I would take. What's the other view?
The other view is that the only way to de-escalate a conflict is to take control of it and become the aggressor. Now, this is the more like, I don't know, neocon route, but to say that, look, yes, we don't want to fight. We wish the fight wasn't occurring, but the fight is occurring and we need to control the outcome. And the only way to control the outcome is to become the aggressor. So we need to be on the front lines. We need to face this thing head on. And that's the other point that I get more from, unsurprisingly, from military professionals that I have on the show, which I interview a lot. I like to talk to the individuals who have boots on the ground experience. And because there's some kind of disconnect. I don't know exactly what it is, Doug, but there's war is inevitable. I mean, I think that's maybe a truth, right? In that the cycle of war has no beginning, has no end. Will always be, right? We will always fight over territory and resources. That's not you might not like it. I don't like it, but it occurs with enough consistency that we could say it's guaranteed. And I don't know. I think that there's a disconnect between the public perception of that necessity and I'm not quite sure, to be honest with you. I like having the military experts on the show because they've been on the front lines. They understand the necessity of defense. They understand some, I'd say, laws of nature, like strength discourages conflict. And if strength does discourage conflict, which I believe it does, and if weakness invites aggression, which I believe it does all throughout the animal kingdom, and I don't think we're any different, then when these conflicts arise, you got to show strength if you want to control them. But pick your moment, right? Like not every fight's your fight. I mean, that's the other side of this, right?
Yeah, but I don't buy that second argument at all because A, Russia is no threat to the US or Canada whatsoever. It's a border war. And just leave it be solved like border wars are always solved. Russia is not in a position, nor does it have the interest in conquering Western Europe. I mean, the very thought is completely ridiculous for all kinds of military and economic and political reasons. So, but with these guys saying, well, now that we're in the war through our proxy, we've got to win, they might provoke World War III. They might. So that's insane. And it's complete, and for what? It's completely pointless. There's nothing to be gained except some chest thumping. And I don't think we can win that war anyway, because the US and Western Europe are just in no position to fight anymore. I mean, with the military having been taken over by ESG and DEI, guys in the Air Force having contests to wear high heels and such, and the trying to change the very character of the armed forces, where people that traditionally went into the military don't want to, telling their kids not to. All of our weapons are ultra high tech, which is good in a way, but bad in other ways. Look, the thing to do with war is stay out of it. Just stay out of it, because it winds up bankrupting you eventually, in addition to killing a lot of people. So I don't think there's any argument for that second position, especially in terms of the Ukraine, and for that matter, in terms of Israel and Palestine.
You bring up an interesting point with the high-tech nature of advanced warfare from a country like United States, and the downside to it, that the more expensive the weapons become. And it's curious that the weapons have become so much more expensive, actually, but they have been. And the maintenance on expensive weapons is astronomical. I think you wrote a piece like recently, and you mentioned the maintenance requirements of an F-35 is like 20 hours of maintenance per hour of airtime. And as a consequence, at any given time, only about 35% of the fleet is actually ready for action, right? And then you see, for example, the Hamas invasion of Israel, which was kind of pieced together in very cheap guerrilla-style warfare, drones you could buy at a department store, jimmy-rigged with weaponry, of course, but, it was very cheap, right, by comparison. And so, you can soup yourself up, but then can you maintain that, right? And it makes it a lot more challenging, actually.
Well, and in addition to that, once we get beyond basically simple kinetic war like they're fighting now, more or less traditionally, just with some new weapons like drones, as this gets serious, the way World War III is really going to be fought is going to be, it's going to be a cyber war, because computers run everything. They run the banks, they run the money system, they run the utilities, they run factories, everything. So that part of this element is going to be a cyber war if it gets really serious. And that could actually shut down civilization if they shut down computers with just software cyber attacks. That's number one. But if you want to get really serious, what's going to happen is it's going to be biological war, because anybody with a high school chem lab and some education can start brewing viruses and bacteria and release them and deliver them. And I'm sure all of the major countries in the world are working on that. So if that happens, then it's really serious. You're looking at billions of casualties. So this can get out of control. You don't need these expensive, clunky toys that the generals like to play with anymore. And, and one of the major things with the U.S. as well, we got the U.S. Navy, which is basically aircraft carriers and submarines. But each of those aircraft carriers, they're sitting ducks, quite frankly, for hypersonic missiles, which the Chinese and the Russians have and could use. And one of those takes out one of those big boys. It's 5,000 sailors and airmen that go down. That's a major scandal. And that's absolutely going to happen. Forget about, mass assault with all kinds of drones and torpedoes that can be launched from hundreds of miles away. And, these are all, the U.S. is in a position with this high-tech stuff. It's like battleships before World War II. They look really good, and they would have won the last war, but this war is going to be very different. It's like cavalry before World War I. That was the flower of armies. So it always changes. And it's definitely going to change for World War III. And the other thing is that since Islam has once again is rising up, which it does periodically over the last 1,500 years, they have an excellent weapon with young, ideologically driven males, of which they've got an unlimited supply, like millions and millions and millions of them. I mean, they're like cheap, really cheap, but smart cruise missiles. So, no, you don't want to get into a war. It's not necessary. You want to avoid it. Doesn't matter with who.
Yeah, makes sense to me. Now, you're in Buenos Aires today, and you're coming back to the United States shortly. You mentioned you're going to stick around depending on how squirrely things get. And so, what concerns you, and what would make you fly south again?
Well, let's just hope that this dust up in the Ukraine doesn't get out of control, because the world could go nuclear there. That's possible. But another thing that they're talking about now is to take the show on the road with, I guess it's bird flu now. It was COVID in 2020 that it's amazing to me. It was a hysteria very similar to the Salem witchcraft trials, where everybody just goes crazy. Or maybe a better analogy was what happened in Germany in the 30s when everybody went crazy, or in China in the 60s when everybody just went completely insane. And it happened in a slightly different way, with all these governments and organizations locking down the entire world for what amounted to nothing more than a new type of flu. And people are unaware of the fact, apparently, that the ordinary seasonal flu kills about 30 to 40,000 Americans every year. And COVID didn't do much worse than that. But what really killed them was the government action in destroying the economy and the vaccines afterwards, which I think are going to be a really major scandal on a number of levels. So it seems like these people are ramping something up with bird flu again. We've lived with viruses and bacteria for hundreds of thousands of years. They're really not that much of a risk. It's part of life. This is not the bubonic plague. Of course, unless some state or non-state actor unleashes a intentionally engineered virus intended to kill people. But all this stuff can happen. And you got to remember that in Washington, D.C., well, just like in Ottawa, we've got actual Jacobins running these governments. And by that, I mean, these are the same people, have the same psychological makeup, the same basic political beliefs as the Jacobins after the French Revolution did. They're very dangerous, and they're ensuring that they're cementing themselves into office. All the new people in these governments are hired by the old people who only hire people to believe what they believe. And so it's not a good situation. I'm, here in Argentina, it's becoming freer, about the only place in the world that it is. And if we weren't in Argentina, I would think I would go to the Orient, quite frankly, which is still progressing more or less apace. They don't have all these crazy mind viruses that we have in Europe and North America.
Any countries specifically, Doug?
Say what?
Any countries specifically?
I'm a big fan of Thailand. Thailand is special. It was the only country that was not invaded and conquered. It's got a very self-contained culture that's very nice. It's generally very peaceful. The weather's good. The food is, I think, some of the very best on the planet. That would be my number one choice. My number two choice would be Japan, actually.
Interesting. Okay. We're heading back to Indonesia in the fall, and Thailand is also on the list while we're there. Because I haven't been.
Where are you going to be in Indonesia? Are you going to Bali mainly?
Yes. Yeah. We go to Uluwatu in the south. Yeah.
Well, I haven't been all over Indonesia, certainly, but I think that Bali is, well, it's different and better than the rest of Indonesia. It's Hindu as opposed to Muslim.
It's an odd, like, Hindu island surrounded by a Muslim country. Interesting history there, actually, but yeah, it's different culture.
Yeah, nice mellow place. So good choice.
Love that. Last question, Doug. I just have to ask, are you allocating cash right now anywhere? And if so, okay, I got a question here from Commodity Culture, actually. Surprised you didn't mention the Balkans. No one mentions the Balkans, which is why it's still a hidden gem. This is actually interesting question. So what are your thoughts on the Balkans as another location to withdraw to?
I don't think it's a particularly good place. I mean, when Yugoslavia broke up into, what was it, 6 different countries, it wound up with civil wars and all kinds of unpleasantness. And I don't think the Balkans are a particularly good choice. It's always been a hotbed of discontent, and none of those governments are particularly free market or libertarian value oriented. So no, I would not put the Balkans on my shopping list, actually. Look, as a place to hang out that I like, I actually like the Turkey, the coast of Turkey. I mean, yeah, it's a Muslim society, but it's kind of mild, and I love Istanbul. But the Balkans, I can't think anything that would draw me there. And I think Croatia would probably be the best choice in the Balkans, is my opinion.
Croatia. Yeah. I know that's where our buddy Commodity Culture was based for a little while. Anyways,
Mhm.
a country my wife loves. All right, look, Doug, last question for you. Where are you allocating cash right now, if anywhere? What strikes you as appealing? Are you allocating capital, and where to?
Well, I've been grossly overinvested in Argentina for years, with some friends and as an individual. We bought a lot of real estate down here, and at some point soon, I think we're finally going to break even, maybe even make money. Number one, I think Argentine stocks are very interesting right now, as this place free marketizes. The economy is going to boom down here, so you can get good dividends on Argentine stocks, and they're pretty cheap, unlike the US stock market. Second thing, but where would I really be, and where am I with almost all of my speculative capital, those things accepted? Resource stocks, and that means oil and gas, which is very cheap. Everybody hates oil and gas, and could give you, relative to where it's been in the past and all. Oil and gas are very, very cheap. And of course, gas, although it's been going up recently, is close to all-time low levels. So I like these little Canadian gas stocks, some of them. The decent dividend yields. I think gas can go a lot higher. Oil can go a lot higher. So I like them. Love uranium stocks, because nuclear is the safest, the cheapest, and the cleanest type of mass power generation, hands down. There's no question about that. And I can explain that rather outlandish sounding statement, but we don't have time to do that now. And of course, these crappy little mining stocks, and they are crappy, but the world is going to need copper and gold and nickel, and they've been down for a long time. They're really, really cheap. Some of them are actually interesting for dividend yields. So, yep, I am very overcommitted to them, and I think I'll be right with them sometime in the next year or 2 years. It's way overdue, but when they run, they'll run 5 or 10 to 1 easy. So that's where I am. Most of them are crap, but there's some really good little companies out there that are selling for barely more than the cash they got in the bank, and you get the properties for free. And sometimes the management's really good. You get that for free too. Most of the time it's crap though.
But I appreciate the reference to your time horizon. It could be a year, it could be 2 years. I think that's super important for junior mining investors to remember. And often when companies get mentioned on shows like mine or, dozens of others, they assume that means the host or the guest is saying that company is going to go up within the quarter or right away, and that's not what long-term value investing is, right? You buy things when they're cheap and then you wait, and it's lost on a lot of folks, actually.
Yeah, and mostly, speaking for myself, what I try to do is buy these stocks with private placements, finance them. So the money goes to the company to do things, hopefully intelligent things, as opposed to just another investor that wants to bail. But warrants are usually attached, and those warrants can be extremely valuable. So that's the way I generally do it. And of course, you've got to know people in the business, people that are trustworthy. So it takes time to, but private placements are the way to do it, if you can.
Yeah, if you can. And with the right people, as you mentioned. Look, I appreciate that. I appreciate the feedback in your experience in Argentina. I was really, really curious living there, how the impact of Malay has been felt, and that you're quite confident in your investment there. My wife lived in BA for a while, and it's another area on our short list. I mentioned we have a bunch of areas that are shortlisted right now. And she's proposed going back to Argentina. I've never been, so I'm kind of all in. I'm like, sure, why not?
Oh, let me know. No, you'll like it. It's very nice, very sophisticated. It's one of the world's great cities, and right across the Plate River is Uruguay, and Punta del Este, which is one of the world's kind of jet set places, if you like that type of thing during the summer. So it's very nice.
Very nice. Okay, look, Doug, thank you for coming on today. I appreciate it. Thank you to everybody who showed up and tuned in live. It's great to have you here. Internationalman.com is where you will find all of what Doug puts together. He's recently put out some new reports on managing your portfolio through the, I was going to say upcoming crisis, but the ongoing crisis that just seems to be escalating and percolating around the globe. But internationalman.com, you'll find Doug's books, newsletters, and lots of material there. Doug, thanks so much for coming on today. I appreciate it.
Much appreciated, Jay.